Welcome, everyone. Thanks for coming to this BAICE webinar, the British Association for International and Comparative Education. This is a webinar that Dilrabo Johnbekova and I created on behalf of BAICE. Uh, because the conference, many of you may know, the conference only happens every 2 years. So we thought between 2 years, a lot of things have happened and we miss out on very rich conversations that many of us have with our colleagues, especially in the hallways of a conference. So in an attempt to recreate that and open it to everyone in the world, everyone can join this webinar. Dilrabo and I created this webinar. Our intent is to really stimulate discussion. So the webinar series is not a presentation. It's not empirical work, another PowerPoint. Those are great, but that's not the space for what we are doing. And we are planning to have an hour with our three guest speakers today, and then we will have half an hour of Q&A discussion with the audience. If anything happens with the technology, Dilrabo will take over. Okay. My name is Jack Lee. I am based at the University of Glasgow. Dilrabo Johnbekova, she is based at Nazarbayev University in Kazakhstan. We have three speakers today. I won't go into the details of their bios, and it was in the registration page. So we have first, I'll say briefly, Hilary Cremin. Hilary is the head of Faculty of Education at Cambridge. We then have Luke Roberts, who is the CEO of Resolve Consultants. And finally, we have Kevin Kester, who is based at Seoul National University in Korea. So welcome, everyone. Thanks for participating. This came out of a conversation Kevin and I had at the last BAICE conference in Sussex. Given the rising number of conflicts globally, where's the role of peace education and peace education research in our community? Okay. We have a list of guiding questions, so I'll just start off with that. First question for our panel is, what do you think are the core principles and values that guide peace education? And are these principles and values fit for current times? Hilary?
I think it's particularly pertinent this week as we commemorate the 80 years since the liberation of Auschwitz, since the end of the Holocaust, that we remember that peace education really came out of the world wars in the 20th century, the Second World War. And I think there was a really strong feeling at the time of never again. Never again must we allow these atrocities to happen, and that education somehow was capable of educating a whole new generation of people for whom the kinds of atrocities that we witnessed would be unthinkable. Um, I think we can ask ourselves the extent to which we've been successful in that. Hence the subject of this session today. I think I think one of the issues is thinking about peace education through a kind of a banking model. The idea that somehow we can teach children about peace, we can educate them to be future peaceful citizens, and that somehow that they're this repository of learning that at some point when they're out in the world, 5 years later, 20 years later, 50 years later, they will pull out the education somehow that they've been given and act in peaceful ways out in society. I don't think that's how we think about learning anymore. I'm not sure that that's a particularly viable way of thinking about learning. I think learning happens all the time. And we learn in public spaces, we learn through in our institutions. And schools are not cut off from society in that way. So I think that's the first thing that I want to say. And then the second thing I want to say is that peace education is a very wide topic. So we think about education from the point of view of inner peace and well-being. We think about it from the point of view of interpersonal peace, relationships, conflict resolution, techniques, mediation, and so on. We think of it through critical peace education, through society, community. We think about global citizenship as peace education. And we also increasingly think about our relationship with the planet as part of peace education. And so that has many benefits because it means that we can have a single lens of peace while thinking across all of these areas. And of course, they all need to be joined up in order for peace education to be effective. But it also means that it's quite a diverse field, and it's sometimes hard to focus in on a question like, is peace education still working, or what are the values and principles of peace education? Because it's so wide. So I just wanted to say those things here at the beginning in order to just give us an idea somehow of the scope of peace education. And I'm sure that Kevin and Luke will have things which they want to say about that too.
Mm.
Thank you for a very holistic and dynamic view of how the field is moving and progressing. Kevin?
Yeah, thanks, Jack. And Delaro, thanks for hosting this seminar. I want to begin with a few stories, actually, from three very close colleagues in peace education that I've been working with, who've indicated to me recently that they're moving away from peace education, or at the very least, they're beginning to question the field a bit more. Now, one of these colleagues is from Afghanistan, so she worked in Afghanistan for 5 or 10 years. And in 2021, after the Taliban retook the government, she began to feel that her work in peace education had actually disarmed the students' minds and prevented them from being able to resist the Taliban. So she felt partly responsible for this acquiescence that she saw of citizens toward rising up against the Taliban. Another is from, and so she decided to abandon peace education. Another is from Palestine. A colleague recently who said that she's walking away from peace education, at least at the moment, due to it being incapable of adequately responding to the war in Gaza. And a third colleague from Korea, who's a longtime peace educator, is now grappling with questions on the role of violence in peace and peacekeeping. She and many others are calling for capital punishment at the moment against the Korean president in response to his declaration of martial law back in December. And that act of martial law has forced many Koreans to relive the traumas of the violent dictatorships in the past, and capital punishment is perceived for them as a corrective measure to ensure that it never happens again. So her move to call for capital punishment in the political arena is leading her to question the role of nonviolence in peace education, and or whether she should even continue to be involved in the field. And what is telling in each of these cases for me is how confronting direct military violence, or for others, structural and epistemic forms of violence, has led to these colleagues to re-question their commitments to peace education. And these questions all raise the premise of this panel. Is it time to let go of peace education? Now, Jack, I want to answer very specifically and build on what Hilary had responded in terms of your question. Now, I would say that some of the core principles included in peace education include active nonviolence. And so that's the premise that my Korean colleagues starting to dig deeper into, which involves emphasizing the importance of resolving conflicts without resort to physical or emotional harm, and a way of thinking and interacting that fosters peace at all levels in our relations with ourselves, with others, with our communities, and with nature. Justice is another core component to our work, or at least should be core to our work in peace education. And this includes seeking to address the underlying inequalities and systemic injustices, aiming for a world where people are treated with dignity and have access to the same rights, resources, and opportunities. Promoting empathy is another core value. Dialogue is a modality that we use for mutual understanding to listen to others with an open mind, build caring, compassionate relationships. And here I think the Earth Charter expresses it quite elegantly when they say that peace is right relationships with ourselves, with others, with other life. And in this regard, our relationships should be reciprocal, not transactional, allowing ourselves to be affected by others. And finally, critical thinking is a core foundation for all of this. To critically examine narratives, critical examination of history, systems of power, privilege, oppression, interrogating the causes of violence, inequality, and war. Now, these are not all the values of peace education, of course. We can't go through all of this in an hour, but they are some of the more central areas that immediately come to mind. And I would argue that these principles and values are incredibly relevant today, perhaps as needed as ever. Nonviolence continues to be crucial in combating rising political extremism and assessing and responding creatively to all forms of violence in our life world. Justice remains at the forefront of fostering peace for all through our teaching and our social movements. Dialogue is fundamental to a process of fostering mutual understanding and commitment, especially in an age, which I'm sure we're going to discuss more, of ideological polarization and state isolationism, breaking down international cooperation. And critical thinking is necessary to help us navigate the complexities of war, violence, and divisiveness. Now, I'm going to critique many of these principles further as we speak, but when I critique them, it doesn't mean that I'm rejecting them. So, Hilary, that would be my extension in what you had just mentioned.
Excellent. Thanks for picking up some of these points about positive and negative peace, right? So it's not simply the lack of violence. You've extended it to far beyond many issues that are not unique within the field of peace education. So, and the real life examples you picked up. Thanks. Luke?
Hi, Jack. Hi, everyone. Really excited to be here. Please do ask questions in the chat as well as you go. And I think I'll just take that kind of final point about negative and positive piece, kind of thinking about Johan Galtung's work. And I think, if we put it into the context, my kind of theoretical lens is always complex systems. So whose peace, whose conflict, whose negative peace, whose positive peace, in what system are the questions that I would be posing. So kind of building on both what Hilary and Kevin has just said, if we're thinking about when does negative peace occur, when can it mutate and transition into positive peace, and when can positive peace, i.e. The connection of relationships and identities and communities, mutate into negative peace, which is simply you leave me alone and I'll leave you alone. And that dynamic interplay between the two, I think, is crucial. So when we're saying peace education, what type of peace are we educating towards becomes an interesting question. And when we get there, what type of peace then provides the conditions for a different type of education? So you can see my mind is always kind of in flux with these things as well. So I think hearing, particularly what Kevin said, around some of the skills that we need, absolutely agree with. And I think part of the challenges that we're going to face as we go through this talk is about how relevant some of those skills are to the context and systems we find ourselves in now.
Excellent. Thanks for picking up these points about, Galtong's work of positive and negative peace. The next question is peace education a failed enterprise? A very difficult question. Who would like to go?
Maybe Hilary, is it okay if I start first this time?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Rotate the starting. Yeah, Jack, that's a pretty heavy question. And I think it depends on how we define peace education and what we consider to be failure. As Hilary mentioned a moment ago, there are so many different ways of framing peace education, from Betty Reardon's framing of comprehensive peace education, and the distinctions between education about peace, or the content of peace education, education for peace, or the values of peace education, education through peace, the pedagogy of peace education, or those who make distinctions between psychosocial peace education and more socio-political peace education, which Mario Novelli's work has done. And he makes a distinction between peace education and peace building education. So I think in answering the question, we have to ask which of these framings are we saying has failed? And in which ways has it failed? And I think we should also remember that there are so many approaches to peace education, from traditional or regular or liberal normative peace education to postmodern peace education to critical peace education to decolonial peace education and to emerging forms today of trans-rational and post-critical peace education. So it may be more appropriate to speak of peace educations in the plural. And how do we assess these different approaches? Have they all failed? In what ways? Now, to be sure, it doesn't matter which framing we choose or approach, all of them may not seem to be delivering immediate or widespread results today, especially given how entrenched conflict, violence, and inequality are in many parts of the world. But to say it's a failed enterprise might be a bit too harsh. Peace education isn't just about large-scale political peace. It's also about fostering conflict resolution skills, about fostering empathy, about critical thinking, about engendering a sense of agency and hope, something so necessary today. And I don't mean naive hope here, but having a sense of purpose and a deeper meaning, unless all that we're engaged in education and peace education is to be relegated simply to the technical or the practical. And I suppose that this is where Hillary's going to speak a little bit later about utopias and heterotopias and the need to have a vision, a bigger vision. And from where I'm sitting, there have been many failures, which I'll speak more about later, and many successes, even if they're not always visible. And I think the first, for me, first and foremost, of the first of the positive relations, the care and the love that the graduate students in our Education, Conflict, and Peace Lab at SNU have fostered over the past 5 years. It's amazing to watch them come alive and the lab to flourish. And I imagine that this must be what it's like for Hilary in Cambridge, or for the many others in this discussion today who oversee programs that are similar. The students in these programs, they have a tremendous impact on peace and conflict transformation in their own communities. But definitely before I stop here, I can understand the frustration, why we might feel that peace education has failed. It's hard to look at the state of the world today, the ongoing wars, the deep division, rising nationalism, climate disasters, and feel like any kind of peace-focused initiative is making enough of a difference. The real challenge might be the gap between theory and practice, and the messy reality of how systems of power, identity, and political economies shape our world, and how we make peace education more fit for purpose to respond to these challenges.
Yeah, I think, Kevin, you've picked up on many of these things that are intangible, in fact, right? We are obsessed with metrics of what we can see as outcomes and results. Hillary, do you want to pick up?
Yeah, I want to segue into Luke. Luke, I'd love it if you could talk about the journey that we went through together when you began your PhD, and how your thinking was transformed through the process of your PhD, and why it is that complexity and chaos theory have become so important to you. But I'll just start off by talking from my own point of view, that um, as people on this call, some people on this call will know, I started out working for the Quaker Peace Education Project. And it's lovely to see some people from that project who are on this call today, I've noticed. Um, I spent about 10, 12 years altogether developing peer mediation, conflict transformation, restorative approaches, circle pedagogy in hundreds of schools, working with thousands of teachers. And the thing that really brought me up sharp was that despite the fact that people always said during these workshops, at the end of these workshops, that this was exactly what they'd been looking for. That the punitive and hierarchical nature of schools could be challenged through these methodologies, which they felt was so powerful and so important. But that whenever I went back a few months or a few years later, always schools had reverted back to the norm, and a lot of the peace education work that I'd done with them had disappeared. So I have to say that after a while, I got pretty burnt out. And when I came into academia in 2001, I had a big question, which was, why is it that despite so much promise, schools as institutions are not able to embed these kinds of restorative and peaceful approaches? And I think that's where I really strengthened down through my work into Galtung and into ideas of positive and negative peace and structural and cultural violence in schools as institutions. And so I feel that what is really important for us as peace educators is to look at the ground beneath our feet, to notice the structural and cultural violence that are endemic within our institutions and within our societies, within geopolitics, and to find ways of working with those things as a process rather than thinking as peace as some kind of an outcome or as a set of knowledge that we can teach. We have to work towards peace as peace educators within the messy relations that surround us and that are part of where we find ourselves being situated. And that for me is the real challenge. So peace education as final outcome, I would say, is a failed enterprise. Peace education as process, which takes fully account of the structural and cultural violence that in which we are embedded and which advertently and inadvertently we find ourselves reproducing. That's where we should be, in my view. And Luke, I'd love you to share your story as part of this, which I think is really fascinating.
Thank you, Hilary. I'll try and remember it then. It's a challenge. So, taking Hilary's point, I was very interested in models of school change, particularly the whole school approach as a methodology for supporting schools with, for example, it could be trauma-informed practice, social justice, whatever you want to label the change as. What is the model of change that best helps the organization to enact that? And what we kind of went through in our journey together was what occurred to me was whatever your initiative is, it's like the icing on a cake. You can put restorative, you can put peace education icing on punitive systems. And over time, the fundamental structure doesn't change, but the language is appropriated to normalize the violence within the system. So this is why I became very interested in looking at complex adaptive systems and their ability to change and, how can I put it, culturally support the ideas and principles, whereas the behavior of the system produces harmful, punitive outcomes of the system. So I think even in the conversation around peace education, can you have peace education in a curriculum in a classroom with a high excluding school, or a school where there is levels of punitive performance management for staff, disconnection with the community? So these tensions within the systems play out a lot. So the question as to whether has it failed, I think some of the stuff that I've noticed in the chat is around, well, if it sits in the margins, does that mean it's never had the opportunity to shine in the light, kind of thing? And then my question would be, well, has the system ever given it the opportunity? And will it ever give it the opportunity to be part of the wider education system? So I think there's that aspect. And then I think part of the idea around has peace education failed as an enterprise depends on whether we see it as a complex, non-adaptive system in an ever-changing environment. And this relates back to Hilary's point about the banking model, that if we're still talking about peace post Second World War, and I'm going to just kind of take us into a different space for a second, I've become incredibly fascinated by hybrid asymmetric warfare, where the threshold between peace and war gets blurred. So if we think of the metaphor of being on a beach for a second, when are you on the sand and when are you on the water, or in the water, I should say? And that threshold of familiar and different becomes really important. And that's where I think this is sometimes referred to as the gray zone, but I'm going to talk about it as a threshold. And within that threshold, we now have the interplay of governmental actors, organized crime, commercial interests, and education. So the question for me becomes, can peace education meet the floor underneath us right now, which is this threshold nexus and interconnection of these different things at play. And so, therefore, some of the skills that Kevin was talking about earlier may be incredibly important, but are they in the context of never quite being at peace, but never being quite at war either? And how do we coexist in this space, in this threshold or thresholds where violence and harm can be perpetuated, and yet we don't necessarily have the educational systems that are able to keep speed with the threshold changes?
Great. Thanks for picking up, the issue of process and, as you said, the liminal space between actual physical violence and many other forms of violence. My next question, I mean, if we talk about peace as a possible failed enterprise, I mean, is this being juxtaposed to uh, the effects of violence? So is violence reduction a better framework rather than peace education? Should we focus our energy on reducing violence rather than actual peace education? Kevin, do you want to go?
Uh, yeah, Jack. So the question is, do we vacate the agenda of peace and peace education, right? And I think the idea here of shifting from peace education to violence reduction, it does seem appealing in some contexts, particularly where the immediate goal is to address the aftermath of conflict and to reduce the harm caused by violence. But whether or not we should completely vacate the agenda of peace education in favor of focusing solely on violence reduction depends on how we view the problem of violence and what kind of long-term vision we want to pursue. So whereas peace education, it's a proactive approach. It seeks to prevent violence in the first place by cultivating empathy, justice, nonviolence, dialogue, conflict transformation. And it aims at transforming the underlying systems of inequality, as well as empowering individuals. Violence reduction, on the other hand, it tends to focus on the immediate aftermath of violence or on measures that seek to minimize the harm caused by violence. And this can include trauma care, peace building and post-conflict settings, the de-escalation and de-escalation strategies. So violence reduction then may be seen as reactive, addressing ongoing crises rather than proactively preventing them. But despite the question, it isn't an either or. We need both, and we can do both at the same time. Effective peace building involves both short-term mitigation of violence and long-term structural change. For instance, during post-conflict reconstruction, we might need to provide immediate violence reduction strategies like disarmament, trauma healing, and law enforcement. At the same time, peace education can foster long-term reconciliation, social cohesion, and a culture of nonviolence that ensures that peace is sustainable. And if we want to break cycles of violence, we need to change the societal norms that perpetuate violence. And here is where education is so fundamental, and peace education. So in other words, in response to this, I think what I would suggest is that, like Luke did in his question a second ago, we transcend beyond the binary of either or, and we look at the overlap between the two.
Hilary?
Okay, Luke, do you want to jump in or shall I go next?
you go first because I'm resisting my urges to wax lyrical on this one, Hilary. So
Okay, okay. So, part of part of the reason why I like to focus on peace rather than just on violence reduction is that I've noticed within education in general, when we focus on the kind of the liberal agenda of responding to harm, so we don't really mind how you live your life as long as you're not negatively impacted by somebody else. And so we're going to remove the impediments, and then we leave it up to you how you live your life. Um, is that what happens is you get neoliberalism. So you get the values of the marketplace come rushing in whenever there's a kind of a vacuum. And I think we have a paucity of imagination at the moment. I think we've become afraid to dream differently about radical change within education, because to put your head above the parapet and to start to think differently is very often to get shot down, because there will always be those who disagree with your particular way of thinking. Whereas it's a lot easier to focus on endlessly analyzing what's wrong with our schools, what's wrong with our society. Our field in general of education, sociology of education, and so on, is full of papers which will tell us in huge amounts of detail what's wrong with the way that we currently organize ourselves. But as Jean-Paul Lederach said, we can't work towards the justice and the future and the peace that we wish if we can't first imagine it. And that's why I like to work with arts-based methodologies a lot in my work, whether it's theatre, poetry, art. We have to find ways of engaging with the utopia that is peace, in order to strive towards it. And as long as we don't imply that my piece is the same as everyone's piece, as long as we continue to be in dialogue and to have exchange and processes for sharing with each other how we imagine peace, I think that there are a few things that are more important than that. I ended my book on positive peace with Terence Bevington, talking not about utopia but about heterotopia. And that's a notion from Foucault, who suggested that heterotopia it's not dystopia, it's not utopia. It's the space within violent relations where we can nevertheless create little oases, little pockets of peace. And we all do that through our work, through our lecture halls and our seminar rooms and our workshops and our classrooms. When we create the conditions of valuing each other, of respect, of giving everybody a space to be heard, of helping everyone within our learning community to thrive in the way that they best see fit. And so I feel that working towards something has value, and that simply looking to mitigate something um, will always limit us.
okay, and building on what has just been said here, I think this question is the one that irks me the most, to be honest, because having had experience of working across the school to prison production line, one of the things that is often spoken about is violence reduction, reducing school exclusions, and this reductionist mindset enables people to kind of use the language of business efficiency as a means of achieving these goals. And what it also does is it keeps the thing you don't want in the foreground of the culture and the mindset of people. So, to give an example, when I used to work in prisons, they said, like, we've got a violence reduction strategy. And my first question was, like, how much do you want to reduce violence by? Is it 2%, 10%, 100? Like, there was no answer to that question because the concept of just being able to reduce something was what stuck in the minds of policymakers and leaders. And I'll give like a real world example that may sound amusing, but keep in mind what we're talking about. So a governor said to me, Luke, my staff want to ban socks in our prison. And the obvious reason was the boys would put in rocks or balls in, weaponizing socks, kind of thing. So if we continue down the route of violence reduction, my response was, well, what happens when they start putting snooker balls in their pants? What happens when they start putting it in their t-shirts? Like the logical train is the safest prison is the one where everyone is naked. So we have now reduced violence to 100%. And it's not that, how can I put it? People start off on this road. It's that inability to explore where do these ideas take you and where does the system co-opt them as well. So you end up with people advocating for things like the banning of socks because the simplistic logic of reductionism takes you to a place where I solve today's problems. And as I said, if we extend that back into the threshold of this interplay of things, it also assumes that violence is quantifiable and forgets the imagination of violence that can happen in the threshold. So are we trying to reduce X type of violence, whereas C type of violence is now rocketing across the threshold because we can't quantify it in the same way. So I think there is a real danger in this, as Hilary said, this deficit mindset in assuming that peace education can be replaced by violence reduction because the system will co-opt it in ways that look efficient but are ultimately harmful to the human endeavor.
Can I just come in with a follow-up point as well? So Kathy Bickmore, who I think is on this call, put me on to Robert Nixon's concept of slow violence. And the thing about slow violence is it never quite hits the headlines. It's the huge amount of harm that happens through climate emergency, through the way that we organize global trade, global economics. It's the slow violence of patriarchy, colonialism, of the excesses of capitalism, that causes huge amounts of harm. Um, but it's never the day on which we tackle slow violence. We always, our attention is always drawn towards the fast violence, the things that hit the headlines, the knife crime. And Luke, I was thinking about the suggestion yesterday that kitchen knives should have their ends blunted in response as a response to the knife crime problem within the UK. Um, we are out of kilter with our violence reduction with or with slow violence reduction with cycles of election cycles and politicians. It's never the time for people to make radical changes which might begin to address this because it's usually costly and the benefits won't be seen for 10 years. And so we find ourselves in a situation where people will try to address the violence of the here and now, or at least to be seen to be addressing the violence of the here and now as a way to gain favour with populations and electorates. Meanwhile, the real harm and damage that's been done is invisibilised because it's long and slow and it's never the time to address it.
Thanks. I appreciate both of you picking up that there is a practical element to our work, right? Beyond the academic side and the theoretical side. The knife crime was a story that was all over the BBC News last night here in the UK. And I like the idea of heterotopia as something manageable that we can actually work on. The next question is about our complicity. All of us work for possibly powerful institutions, including my own here at Glasgow, a very old university. So, in what ways is the work within our institutions implicated in the forms of violence production? How might peace educators work to mitigate such harm, even while themselves a part of the system complicit with the promotion of violence? I'm thinking especially the issue of divestment, as many of you know, students protesting on campus about universities' involvement in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So, what about our roles in our institutions?
Uh, as a current head of faculty, shall I shall I start with addressing that? So I see structural and cultural violence as endemic within my university, um, as in most universities. But I think particularly when we think of the structural and cultural violence of elite universities, where we hold on to ideas around meritocracy and social mobility, both of which I feel to be toxic discourse, toxic legacies. So we use the idea of meritocracy in order to justify wealthy global elites having an education that is out of the reach of the vast majority of the world's population. And as we all know by looking at the outputs, the statistics of education, the socioeconomic status of your parents is the biggest factor in terms of what kind of education outcome you're going to get. And that includes in universities like mine, despite the work that is done around widening participation and so on. So our universities, our schools are complicit in reproducing economic advantage. And yet, the discourse of if you're clever and poor, you will be able to rise to the top within these systems does a real disservice to so many clever people living in conditions where they're never going to be able to obtain a place in a university like mine, a huge disservice. And so I'm not 100% sure how if we're thinking about radical change within higher education, if we're talking about genuine social mobility, if we're talking about education as a beautiful and natural and sacred process, how would we reimagine our universities? How would we reimagine our schools? You would have to take out the element of competition, ranking, the notion of credentializing some at the expense of others. Education would have to be for its own sake, for the joy and the love of learning. We'd have to rethink our assessment regimes around e-portfolios and around credentializing competencies. We'd need an awful lot more education happening in the real world via lecturers and professors and teachers providing an interface and learning opportunities for young people out in the world. Learning needs to be situated, it needs to be for real. If it's happening in an abstract, decontextualized context within the lecture hall, as Lars and Wenger would say, it only creates communities of scholars of the thing being studied. It doesn't create communities of people who are at the top of their game within a particular branch of practice. And so I'd like to feel that the 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 current model of elitism within universities and within schools is beginning to be recognized as a bankrupt notion, and that there are pockets of practice around the world where people are starting to think about doing education differently. In the meantime, I think I'd like to lean into what Kevin said, which is we look for our heterotopias. We look for the quality of relationships within our own research teams, within our own institutions. When I put myself forward as Dean, head of faculty here, I did it on the basis of values. And I said that my touchstone would be equity, accountability, transparency, well-being, and excellence. And every decision that I made would go back to those touchstones. And I've worked really hard in the Faculty of Education at Cambridge to build community and to try to rectify injustices that I could see to allow everybody to thrive. And I'm doing my best within a structurally and culturally violent institution. But other than vacating the space completely, I don't see that I have any other option than to accept the imperfection of the efforts that I'm making.
Thank you. Very inspiring about, these places we work at. And certainly Cambridge is a large institution. Kevin, would you want to follow up?
Yeah, I have a lot of reflections here. Around the ways that our universities, that many of us on this call are working within, perpetuate violence through our curriculum choices, by marginalizing certain histories or groups through disciplinary discrimination, hiring practices, and the NGOs and the global governance agencies that we work with, problematic labor practices that they have by taking skilled labor from the public sector or overworking many of those working in that sector because they're seen as social services and don't deserve a decent salary and decent work hours. It's really problematic how peace and peace education has been so diminished in that regard. But I want to speak more actually around some of the work that Hilary and I have done previously on the ways that peace education as an institution itself, our field, is implicated in these forms of violence production. And one of these areas is around an assumption that we have in peace education about knowledge, rationality, and improved skill sets among individual learners, that this leads to broader social change. And elsewhere, I've seen this expressed as an equation that C, or curriculum plus training plus curriculum intervention equals attitudinal and behavioral changes multiplied by the number of students who participate in these peace education programs. And voila, you have peace writ large. Now, it's a humorous way to put it, but it's nonetheless a core assumption in our field. And I think there are many problems with this equation that we need to unpack. One, that it creates a resulting over-reliance on the psychosocial interventions, the type of peace education critiqued by Vanessa Pupovac, Mario Novelli, Michelino Zimbilas, and many others, where the individual is the locus or the focus for social change, rather than the analysis of social structures. And in the psychosocial approach, the mind of the individual is considered the cause of violent conflict and the realm of building peace, as in UNESCO's constitution. So there's a lot to think about there, but an important insight around this is that critical pedagogy, which is so fundamental to the work that we do in peace education, is itself implicated when it's overemphasizes this consciousness-based or approach that focuses on the head. A second failure or way that peace education is implicated in violence production is the blindness that peace educators may have toward our relative privilege and the cultural values that we're teaching, that particularly those that are amplified through assumptions of Western scientific and technical advancement. So there's really a need for us here to genuinely challenge the status quo and embrace complexity, diversity, and contingency in ways that might impact on our own lived experiences or our privileges. Whiteness, wealth, gender, heterosexuality, regional and institutional privileges are reinforced through some peace education. And Paulo Freire received the award for the UNESCO Prize for Peace Education in 1988. And in his speech to receive that award, he critiqued approaches to peace building and peace education that he perceived to be minimizing conflict, not talking about conflict for the purpose of maintaining an unjust social order or some sense of equanimous co-presence. And when we avoid conflict in the classroom and we avoid discussions of conflict in the work that we are doing, we are then becoming complicit in that reproduction of the status quo. And as Freire said, he says, I do not believe in so-called peace education, that instead of bringing to light the world of injustice, obscures it and has the effect of oppressing its victims even more. So expanding on what Hilary has mentioned, I want to turn the gaze from our educational institutions, universities themselves, which are so implicated in violence production, and toward the field of peace education itself, the educators who our work is aiming to create cultures of peace, and yet through our work, we are sometimes unintentionally, sometimes very explicitly reproducing these forms of violence. And at times when we reflect on this, I think it's overwhelming. But there are ways that we can mitigate this harm and work for meaningful change. We can practice critical reflexivity and acknowledge our complicity in these structures of harm. We can advocate for systemic changes within our institutions toward reforming curricula, pushing for more inclusive, diverse, and just curriculum. We can advocate for better hiring practices. We can create safe spaces for students that challenge traditional power structures. And we can maintain humble and realistic perspectives about what peace education can achieve. It works within much broader systems that limit the capacity of what peace education, it's not a panacea, and we need to keep this in mind. So while we're certainly part of these systems that perpetuate violence, I think the complicity does not negate our capacity to mitigate this harm, to actually continue to work for the cultures of peace that we're trying to cultivate.
Thanks. Luke?
I don't think I have much more to say. I think what I would add is just simply the silos of disciplines probably need to be broken down. So I was very fortunate to have been invited onto a business course in Japan last week where we were talking about mediation. And mediation was seen as a business tactic to achieve your, benefits and your goals kind of thing. But as I spoke about it a bit more from the perspective of restorative practices and mediation as a relationship building piece, the students realized that it didn't just have to be a tactic. It could be a way of fostering understanding and engaging. And I think this is where interdisciplinary practices are often talked about in institutions, but rarely recognized. So I think there's that aspect. And from a kind of taking Kevin's final point about systems, the heterotopias themselves can be very dangerous if you have this part that enables you to be peaceful in violent systems. Because when you step out of it, you then have to have your defenses up, you have to have your strategies engaged. So to what extent can we either expand the heterotopias, or can we create much more niches within systems so that way they are much more able to allow people to experience different identities and ways of being without having to always go, right, that was a great experience. Now I have to put my armor back on and face the system for what it really is.
Thank you. We have about 5 minutes before we open it for Q&A. And I would, for the Q&A, if I call the people, I would prefer that you turn on your cameras so we can actually see you. But the last question for the panel, and in 5 minutes, the future of peace education. So where do you see this going? If we do nothing, what will happen? If we do the minimum, how will it survive? What are the key things you would like to see happen in peace education?
Mm.
So, if I start by saying that I have spent nearly 4 decades now in the world of peace and peace education, and I don't regret a second of it. And to all of the early career researchers on this call, I would urge you to stay with with this beautiful field. the thing that for me makes it beautiful is the fact that all of us, wherever we are situated, will be embedded in situations of inequality, violence, injustice, and peace, and beauty, and connection. And reflecting on that and thinking about how we, through our bodies, through our minds, through our hearts, how we can do whatever is within our scope in order to make things more peaceful, less oppressive, I think is a really worthwhile thing to do. Kevin mentioned humility. Humility is really important. People involved in the field of peace offer themselves as service a lot of the time. It's not a field where you would want big egos or people who are trying to come up with once and for all formulae about how we can achieve this or that. It's one of solidarity. It's one of companionship. My latest book that's just been submitted to Routledge and will be out in July is called Rewilding Education. And this is where I've moved beyond peace education to say, what would the education systems be like if peace education were to be more able to thrive? And it's a radical dream. I think that cultures of schooling around the world are fundamentally violent, and I'm not sure that schools, as they're currently imagined, are capable of redemption. I believe that education should be voluntary throughout the life course, with the possible exception of primary education, which instead of resulting in children who say, "I'm rubbish at maths, I can't draw, don't ask me to sing," end their primary education saying, "I can do anything. I know where to find information. I know how to discriminate between high quality information and poor quality information, and I'm confident and ready to learn." From age 12, I'd want learning opportunities to be happening throughout our communities, whether it's in libraries, in science laboratories, in care homes, in railway stations, and that teachers would have a unique place in instigating learning opportunities, in inspiring young people, and in capturing learning in e-portfolios and so on, but that young people would have authentic learning opportunities. I imagine we'd still have these things called sort of further education colleges, where you might have a 12-year-old sitting next to an 80-year-old doing a level 3 in maths, or whatever that would mean. So there would be opportunities to come in and out of formal learning. But I'd want that to be very much at the gift of the young person to be able to select their education opportunities. And I think we could do this with mentorship, which would be at least weekly, particularly for the youngest children, to help them to navigate the education opportunities that might be in front of them. So the metaphor of rewilding that I've used in my book is the idea that we need to go from monocultures of education systems that are pretty much like agribusiness and factory farming over to metaphors for education that are more like permaculture and that are about ecosystems. So what are the ecosystems that enable our young people to flourish and to learn in authentic situations? How do we help them to feel confident, happy, secure as learners? And how do we help to create the kinds of global citizens that we're going to need if we're going to respond to the omni crises that we currently face, from climate emergency, geopolitics, water security, nuclear threat, and so on and so on, pandemics. If we continue with business as usual, we could very well end up with humanity being extinct. The world, I think, will continue, but whether humanity will have a place in it very much depends on whether we grasp now the reality of the situation that we find ourselves in and radically reimagine education. Otherwise, I think we may be forced to do things differently because business as usual may not be possible.
Luke, do you want to respond next?
No, you go, Kevin.
Okay, I'll keep it very short. It's my hope that in response to the challenges that we've talked about today, that peace education moves toward more decolonial approaches to peace education, toward transrational and toward post-critical approaches. And so this means increasing the need to embrace an embodied and intersectional approach to peace education, an embodied approach that allows for deeply interrogating the intersections between gender, race, class, disability, sexuality, and ourselves and with others. That peace education needs to engage more deeply with issues of colonialism and how colonialism is etched into our bodies and continues to linger, and peace education is implicated within this. Climate change as a driver of conflict needs further engagement. And I recall very vividly in discussions with Betty Reardon 2 years ago, um, her call to attend more to climate change in our field. That peace education needs to promote more critical media literacy today to combat the spread of misinformation and disinformation. In our climate of echo chambers, post-truth, misinformation, disinformation, teaching critical media literacy is so important, and not just for our students, but for all of us. Peace education needs to prioritize global citizenship education and teach the importance of cross-cultural empathy. So I can hope that there will be more cross-pollination between peace education, global citizenship education, environmental education, and that we can overcome some of the schisms that I see in the field today between those who take a psychosocial micro approach to peace education, those that take a cultural, political, economic approach to peace education, and they're having difficulty coming together and overcoming that division within our own field is so critical to be able to move forward on a front to a front against violence. So I hope that we can overcome some of the divisions in our own field.
Right. So now I think I've collected my thoughts, having the weight of both of you put yours out there as well. So I think I'm probably not going to summarize, but more just kind of pose some questions. How does peace education respond to AI as a weaponized force within education? So, for example, there's been an incident recently where a head teacher principal's voice was used to give racial slurs towards a community. And it turned out that he never said those things, but it created enough conflict in the community for him to have to seek protection. Is a challenge for peace education. How does peace education deal with the marginalized? So, for example, young people on the periphery of organized crime with no ideological attachment are used by bad actor governments to commit assassinations as part of gang violence. So there's a response there. And then I think there's also a question about within the weaponization of the threshold, how does education itself get used? For example, can a think tank attached to a particular university ask for a group to be omitted from the curriculum if you want their sponsorship? These are all threshold issues that don't fit neatly into keeping making type logic. So I think the challenge for me around the future of peace education is how does it start to engage with threshold behaviors in the system, keep pace, and potentially get beyond them is the bit that I'm most interested in.
Thank you so much for all your very critical insights, including these reflections about your field and education broadly, particularly the very comprehensive vision that Hilary outlined. At this point, I want to open it to our audience. Now, there are over a dozen questions in the chat.
Some of the young people needed to be in constant contact to reaffirm peace because of the power dynamics they had. So it wasn't just enough to do the first three, it was how do you maintain and ultimately sustain peace in relationships that are always on the precipice of violence because of the way in which the system itself is violent.
Excellent.
And can I just come in and say in a very practical way that there are schools in the world that are bucking this trend. So I was in a school in Doha, Qatar, the week before last, and that school is genuinely rewilded. It's in Education City, and the young people do their art lessons in a world-class art gallery. They have their PE in a fantastic equestrian centre. They do their reading in the national state-of-the-art library, and the ethos in the school is progressive, child-centered. They have very small ratios. Now, that's in a context where money is no object, but I have been able to see how Islamic values, which infuse that particular school and that particular context, have been able to push back against a neoliberalism and against a capitalist norm, which we see so much in our schools elsewhere in the world. So I would say that it's happening there. There's a school in Leeds, Carmanor School, where every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, every member of the school community, including the school cook and the administrator, sit in circles with the children in order to have check in, check up, check out. It's an ordinary school. I've written about it in my new book as a case study. It's staggering. And Ofsted, which is our inspection regime in the UK, love the school. They're getting good results because they're putting human values and relating first. Similarly, Holt School in Birmingham, where they have young people. Royal Leighton has worked with this school as well. Young people and adults who come together in circles and who are bucking the trend within a school that's facing unimaginable levels of knife crime, gang and gang-related violence. So it's happening, and in the spaces where it's happening, it's because that putting the child at the center and that quality of relationship and learning is being prioritized rather than the needs of the neoliberal marketized institution to commodify young people in order to get Ofsted's outcomes, which mean that they can rise in the league tables. These are the kinds of forces that we need to be working against.
Excellent to hear these real life stories about what's happening against the trend. I'm going to call on two people to ask questions for the sake of time, and then the panel can decide how you want to answer. You don't have to answer both. Ben Harper, can you come in? And Crispin Hemson.
Hi, sorry, I was caught on a call there. Uh, yeah, I was. I just wanted to say something about, I think, about the way in which we just have to be very flexible and maneuverable, so guided by some sort of imaginative vision, and then in the process, finding opportunities to open up gaps, because we are working within a context in which language is constantly being used to distort and confuse. But when we work with people at a Sorry, I realized you weren't hearing me. Let me leave it for the moment. I'm sorry.
Okay. Isabel Cartwright?
Thank you. Um, I've just really enjoyed the conversation as someone involved in peace education for Quakers. Read a lot of Hilary's work, and also struggle with lots of those dilemmas around, are you tinkering at the edges, and how do you create radical change? So we've been looking, for example, at peer mediation and how can that work in schools that are really hierarchical. And I remember Hilary a long time ago saying, don't set kids up to fail. If the system isn't sort of broadly restorative, that project might not end up kind of empowering them. So we're looking at different models. Ben, my colleagues on this call, is working with a school, Darwin Community Academy, that are really exploring what are the ingredients that might make that work there in their context. And we've got a bit of time to work with that school, which is nice to kind of go to be there for longer and to hear what the young people are saying, their critiques and criticisms and concerns, as well as their enthusiasm. So if there was anything else to offer around how you'd encourage a school to start thinking about this journey, if there's some interest, but there's not wholehearted support, I suppose, from the school body. If there's one or two teachers, do they focus on what they can do in their classroom, or do they try to win round the whole senior management of the school to make a change?
I think a very simple answer to that question is it's both, but you do it mindfully and carefully, and you consider it possible that you may be causing harm in the process. And so you need to be reflexive about that and work as part of a team where you're constantly supporting and challenging each other to make sure that that you're getting it right.
Jack, let me respond quickly to Crispin. Crispin, if I understood part of your comments and question correctly, it was about opening spaces and working to create these creative energies in our work. And I think this relates back to Kathy's point earlier, or my interpretation of her comment about the empirical. So in our work at the journal APRA, I work at a very large international education journal as the editor. And we received loads of manuscripts over the course of a year, and we're dedicated to DEI. We're working very hard to be inclusive, to include papers coming from the Global South, from non-represented contexts, so on and so forth. And this is very difficult work because of all of the barriers that we're going up against. Inclusion sounds great, but the realities on the ground of the barriers that come into it around linguistic capacities of authors, their training in terms of writing normative academic research is not so straightforward. So what I'm saying here is it's the dedication to the work, the continual persistence to create policies and space to work with these authors that eventually leads to a positive outcome. It isn't easy, it's messy work, but the persistence of it, open space, and the thing about it that I think you're getting at, they're unexpected. We don't know the space we're going to create, but by the creative energies between all the parties, we co-create these possibilities together. And so I think it's that persistence that's really important here.
Great. Rena, do you want to come in?
Sure, thanks. Hope everybody can hear me. Yeah, my question was a little bit tagging on to comments that all of you made, but in particular Luke Roberts when he spoke about whose peace. So if you could expand a little bit about that argument of, whose peace are we engaging with? Whose peace are we, in a way, fighting for? And yeah, this connects to Kevin's comments on his stories of Afghanistan, South Korea, and Palestine. and Hilary Cremin's comments on violence in schools, because very often there are competing perspectives on whose peace we're engaging with. If we look at the conflicts in Ukraine and in Israel-Palestine at the moment, of course, there's always a question of, whose perspective are we uplifting? Which marginalized groups or conflict-affected persons and communities are we engaging with and supporting? But also, whose pieces are we not engaging in? So in a sense, how can peace education actively engage with entrenched violent conflict between competing actors, and not become passive or complicit in non-engagement? Thanks so much.
Shall I go? Well, thank you for the question. I think there's two parts to it for me. There's how is peace defined? And so again, when I was working in prison last year, I asked some young men, like, what does peace mean to you? And they all just burst out laughing at me. Like, it was such a stupid question to ask in their setting, kind of thing. And I think this goes back to one of the questions in the chat as well about violence reduction, which is if we try and quantify peace in some ways, then we've already implied a definition. And I think somebody else has also put peace indicators in there. So when we started to ask, well, when I started to ask the question about, well, what does peace look like, feel like, sound like to you? That opened up a very interesting conversation about peace is actually quite boring. And so, what is the exciting elements of peace that could be found? And importantly, how then do we start to co-construct peace within these systems of violence as well? And I thought that was the start of a very interesting conversation that goes back to the original points that were being made about not just being reflexive and critical thinking and empathetic, but also the point that we can then, through our own definitions, start to imagine how to apply peace in our everyday systems. And I think that's when something more genuine and authentic started to emerge for the group as well. So I think, again, for me, it's how is peace co-constructed is going to be the critical question.
Rena, thank you for your beautiful question. I'm actually much more interested in what you would have to say in response to your question. I think what I'd like to point out here, so the three that I emphasized, Afghanistan, Palestine, Korea, and I also spoke of China and Taiwan a moment ago. My suggestion of reframing and rethinking the status quo, as you point out, is so specific to that context. I'm not drawing out some, tenet that we can apply in every other setting. For Palestine, that doesn't make sense. That is not a transferable argument for what's going on in the Middle East. But for under the conditions and what's happening in this context, that was the expression of peace from the participants in my particular study. And so the cases that I spoke of at the beginning, Afghanistan, it's one educator. Palestine, it's one educator. Korea, it's one educator. So I'm not drawing huge sort of conclusions from this, but I think it does point to, as we've discussed in the past 90 minutes, some of the real limitations of our field and whether we need to start thinking twice about how we engage it. There's a postmodern question, kind of postmodern sort of tone to that as well. And I get a little sometimes concerned when we go down this avenue of what is your interpretation of peace? What is your interpretation of peace? What is the next person's interpretation of peace? Because it can just go down so many different directions. And then how do we pull it back into something that becomes meaningful and actionable? And I don't interpret your question in that way, but I have a little bit of ambivalence toward the individualized interpretations of what peace might be.
Excellent. Thanks. We're going to take two final questions at the same time, and then we're going to wrap up. Agnes and then Joe Westbrook, please.
Hello. I was interested in the question of who should be educated. And as someone who's been an education leader over the years, I never came across the opportunity to be educated in peace. Um, I simply have a personal interest in it, but it was never offered to me in terms of, say, leadership training. So, yeah, I'm just really interested in whether targeting leaders with this kind of education or professional development would make a difference. Is it happening? Is it happening around the world? What evidence is there that it's working if it is happening?
Great. Joe Westbrook?
Well, I put a question in there. It's just so vast, and we are talking about whose peace, and there is this very direct violence and conflicts going on, which if you're not there and you're not directly involved, it's that for me is we can't theorize. It's too immediate. But of course, it's part of the larger discourse. And I suppose that right at the other end, that's what I'm saying, this the very local sense. So Hilary, you work in what schools can do wherever they are without calling it peace, because that then puts a name on it and it's reductive. And then I'm just constantly swaying, but is that enough that you resist things, that you have circles? Does it stay within the school? Does it go anywhere? It's those two. They're not the same thing, and I'm just interested in getting your reflections on that. But if you don't do anything, then you are complicit if you don't engage.
Thank you very much. Panel, last bit.
I think that is the postmodern dilemma, isn't it? It's at what level do you go in? Um, and the fact that you know that the structural and cultural violence originates in things which are way beyond your own sphere of influence, does that mean that you don't take the first step? The fact that you can't possibly be an activist and be of direct support in all of the different conflicts situations in the world. Does that mean you don't then engage with the first one that you come across? And how deep do you go? And what are the normative? We need normative values in order to be able to have a conversation, but whose values are they? And what happens when you get incommensurate values in the same space? So I think my final point is one around complexity and around journeying, and that this being an incredibly rich and privileged journey to be on with good folk who are also grappling with the same kinds of questions. Um, but I certainly, after 4 decades, don't have a simple answer that I can give you, I'm afraid, other than roll your sleeves up, get in there, be reflexive about what you're doing, care about different perspectives, even when they're different from your own.
Yeah, Agnes, I think I'll respond to what you raised. So as somebody who's done a little bit of research on the impact of peace education earlier on, and was interested in what happens with students who go through these programs. So a student, self decides that they want to go through peace education, which is offered at a university. What do they do afterwards? And what we find often is that they maintain it. So they go into fields of peace and conflict. They work in NGOs. They work in universities. They work in schools. They teach peace education. They create programs, or at least they create lessons, or they create classes where they're able to teach this in their particular context. In regard to Joe Westbrook's very elegant points, when we examine these peace education programs, they take place. So this is in the UN universities. So these are in the UN universities in Tokyo and Costa Rica, in fairly developed context, not directly conflict affected settings like others that I've talked about. But the students who go through these programs are from those settings. And so they take this learning back to Cyprus, divided Cyprus, or they take this work back to Somalia and Somaliland, where I'm working. And they've developed peace education programs that are so needed in that setting. And so there is some degree of a multiplying effect. Now, it's difficult to measure this, of course, and to give, causal conclusions from it, but there is self-reported impact of the work of peace education in the lives of those who choose to go through these programs.
And just from my side, I'll try and answer both questions. The world is complex. We are interdependent and interconnected. And I think one of the best systems thinkers, Martin Luther King, said, we're all part of a rich tapestry. So even though things may not feel like they're affecting us, they are part of our rich tapestry of relationships. And I think with that in mind, the point about top-down leaders, I think the risk is you can educate the leader, but if they're not networked, the system will co-opt them over time. And networks are a powerful way of keeping ideas interconnected and interdependent. And so things like this event are fantastic because there's a network of engagement going on here. And it's how we make sure that those networks remain open, that those networks remain energetic, and also those networks create the conditions for new forms of emergence to come.
Excellent. Thank you so much for the panel and our participants. I am stunned. I mean, we still have over 50 people online. This is a great turnout. So thank you all three of you. A quick shout out to my PhD supervisor who's actually in the room, Ruth Hayhoe. She wrote an incredible article on redeeming modernity. So your point about this modernity and post-modernity, Ruth comes out very articulate on this. I would highly recommend you read her work. Hilary, can you remind us the title of your new book for the audience?
Yes, it's called Rewilding Education, and it will be available through Routledge in about June time.
Thank you. And Luke, can you remind us your book?
Great question. I think it is called Leading Schools and Sustaining Innovation, How to Think Big and Differently in Complex Systems.
Great. So thank you very much for your time. And if anyone listening here is interested in BAICE taking on a topic for the webinar, please contact me or Dilrabo. We're happy to promote this kind of discussions, not a research presentation. It's quite stimulating for all of us to learn from these experts. And I hope you have a great week. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jack. Thank you, everyone. Good evening.
Thanks.